Welcome to Homegrown Tales, a live storytelling event held at Brews, 2 Piney Spring in Eureka Springs. The following was recorded April 2nd, 2025. And now here's Zeek Taylor to introduce the program.
My co-producer, Sandra Spotts, and I welcome you to Homegrown Tales. Sandra and I are excited to be joined on stage by guest storytellers, Lynn and Al Larson. And we're glad their fan club's here too. Yeah, this is going to be the first time we've had a duo of storytellers, so we're excited about that.
So glad that you all turned out and you knew that the sun was going to come out, didn't you? So glad that you're here. The Missouri Ozarks is both home and backdrop to Missouri Arts Council touring performer Mick Bird. A member of the Missouri Blues Society and Tennessee Songwriters Association International, Mick has performed at the legendary Bluebird Cafe in Nashville for more than 20 years. An award from Billboard magazine kicked off his music career in 1994. Mick presents to fans an amazing array of original roots, rock, country, and his signature Ozark blues. Whether in his travels across Missouri, the United States, or Ireland, Mick brings audiences a snapshot of life in the Midwest with warm and powerful vocals and fingerpicked guitar. Audience everywhere find common ground in his music. Mick Bird.
There's no black, no white, but it's just the blues.
Our first reader is my Tales co-producer, Zeek Taylor. Zeek is a recipient of the Arkansas Governor's Art Award for Lifetime Achievement. He has appeared on the NPR show Tales from the South, and a StoryCorps interview with Zeek is on file in the Library of Congress. And I want to remind you that all the stories that you will hear tonight are true and written and lived by the people who will be telling them. A segment of the recorded interview of Zeek aired on NPR's Morning Edition program, and it was heard by 50 million listeners. Zeek was recently selected to participate in the Northwest Arkansas Generational Journeys program. As part of the program, he is a mentor to Thaddeus High School senior Meadow McGinnis, who is documenting Zeek's life, and it's worth documenting. The documentation will become a permanent part of the archives of the Pryor Center in Fayetteville. Zeek is a published author. His most recently published book is Out of the Delta, the Anthology. Now here's Zeek.
Thank you. Lawmakers in Arkansas have introduced a bill that would allow lawsuits against anyone who facilitates a minor's social transitioning, including hairdressers and barbers who give gender nonconforming haircuts, teachers who use a student's chosen name that is different from their birth name, and nonprofit organizations that offer support. This was titled the Vulnerable Youth Protection Act. If passed, it would have allowed parents to sue someone who supports a minor's gender transition, with the statute of limitations being 15 years. Thank goodness this ridiculous law was withdrawn yesterday. Yeah. I have to add, also another law that didn't get out of committee today was one that was going to allow cockfighting in Arkansas. Tonight I'm reading a story that I wrote a while back about past silly rules and ridiculous laws. It's called Break the Rules. When I was growing up in the Arkansas Delta, there were some things one did not do. Some were written into law, while other taboo activities were based on social customs and community mores. Until the 70s, it was against the law in Arkansas for a man to go to a beauty shop or for a woman to go to a barber shop. Even though my mother owned a beauty shop, my daddy went to the local barber. His reason for getting a weekly trim at Irby's barbershop had nothing to do with the law. He told my mother, since Irby's wife Cricket comes to you each week for a shampoo and set, it's only right that I go to Irby for my haircuts. I think he went for the gossip. When my father went to the barber, some men would not. When Elvis Presley rose to fame, a few of the local fellows wanted to have their hair look like their idol's hair. Elvis had long, slick black hair. At least it was long for the time, and he had bushy sideburns. As good as Irby was as a barber, he was not capable of creating a longer style. Guards on his electric clippers wouldn't allow him to leave the hair any longer than 2 inches. In the dark of night, my mother would lower the shades in her beauty shop and allow select clients to secretly enter. They were men. The guys trusted my mother to style their locks and leave them with a longer look. They left the beauty shop through the back door of our house while sporting an Elvis Presley hairstyle. One of the men went a step further and had my mother tint his hair Elvis black. She kept on hand to supply Miss Clairol black velvet hair dye for that special customer. Although my mother was at risk of being fined or losing her beauty operator's license for styling men's hair, she thought the law was unreasonable, and she willfully broke it. I also think she liked the thrill of being an outlaw. Other Arkansas laws were just as silly. At one time, it was against the law in Arkansas to walk a cow down the street on Sunday after 1 p.m. Some rather strange laws are still on the books. It is still against the law to keep an alligator in a bathtub. Just as strange as the laws, and often as foolish, were rules and social mores that were prevalent in many towns in the South. A woman could smoke cigarettes, but societal rules prevented her from indulging while walking. To be a proper lady with a lit Salem in hand, she had to remain seated. Many of the rules regarding social conduct were more restrictive when it came to women. Another silly social rule was at school, male teachers could wear comfortable slacks, while female teachers were required to wear dresses. Professional women, and that included teachers, did not wear form-revealing pants to work. Local social rules and mores kept provocative parts of a woman's body covered and protected from the lusty eyes of boys and men. It was thought that pants showed too much of a woman's provocative shape. Back then, in the heat of summer, men wore suits and neckties to church, and this was before air conditioning was available. Women were not thought to be properly dressed at church unless they had on a dress, gloves to cover their hands, and a nice hat on their head. My mother owned a dozen hats, and she had a large assortment of colored gloves. She had gloves to match every Sunday outfit. My mother was a forward thinker who didn't take kindly to discriminatory rules and mores. When pantsuits became fashionable, she was among the first in our town to attend the First United Methodist Church while wearing them, and she did it without hats or gloves. A scandalous breaking of the men's only rule occurred in my hometown during the early 60s. A bold college co-ed in my hometown, who was home on spring break, defiantly marched through the door of the local pool hall. She grabbed a pool cue, challenged a local shark to the game, and beat his butt. She promptly exited the building, leaving many a drop-jawed man in shock. She was the talk of the town for several weeks. In my life, I have defied social mores and rules, and admittedly, I may have broken a few laws. But please know that I have never kept an alligator in my bathtub. Thank you. Sandra Spotts has written for several Central Arkansas publications, and her work was recently published in Emerge magazine. She has made 12 appearances telling her original stories on the internationally broadcast radio show Tales from the South. Sandra has a background in fine arts that began with work as a fiber artist. She has been an art teacher and has worked as a professional designer. For the past several years, she has called Eureka Springs home, where she continues her art career as an abstract expressionist painter. Here is my friend Sandra.
This story is called You Better Think Twice. The yell seemed to come from nowhere. Startled, I jerked as I put the key in the doorknob. I looked backward, forward, and then to the house next door, finally spotting the owner of the voice, a tiny black woman whom I judged to be in her mid-50s, around my age. "Yes, thinking about it." She said, "You gonna buy that house?" She yelled back, "You better think twice, sister friend." Puzzled, I continued onto the screened-in porch, trying to discern whether she intended the comment as a threat or a neighborly piece of advice. Either way, it couldn't be good news. She walked to the edge of the driveway separating her property from the house my new husband and I had just closed on. With hand on hip, she went on as I paused on the porch. "Yeah, I sure think twice. I'm Benny D, like Mickey D but with Benny instead." She chuckled, amused by her own little joke. I answered, "Nice to meet you, I'm Sandra. Is there something I don't know about this house?" Benny D started crawfishing. "No, I don't know anything about that house." "I'm just saying," she replied, looking up and down my frame. I could almost hear her thinking, "That has got to be the whitest woman I have ever met." My husband and I, before we met, had each ended our long-time marriages. We both had been either too generous or too stupid, depending on who's telling the story, to end up with many assets between us, and therefore we needed to do some serious scaling down at this point in our lives. We had convinced ourselves that this house was a great buy and that the area was again on the rise. Both of us had fond childhood memories of the once scenic neighborhood that had grown tatty around the edges. "Yeah," we repeatedly told all who would listen, "this is the new Hillcrest," referring to a trendy neighborhood with homes of the same vintage. "Except over there, you'd have to put a 1 in front of the price we're paying." Then we'd chuckle, smug in our business savvy. 2 weeks later, we moved in and under the watchful eye of Benny, who sat on her porch with a huge tumbler of something liquid and arms folded across her chest. Every now and then, she was joined by a friend or two who helped her assess the new neighbors. We had painted, floored, and refurbished with the enthusiasm and energy of 20-year-olds. We freed the windows of their bars and planted flowers. I especially loved the multi-paned picture window that looked out onto Benny's front lawn. We remodeled the kitchen and decluttered the patio and backyard. This little bungalow in the new Hillcrest would suit us just fine. After another week of porch sitting and observation, Benny knocked on the door bearing a plate of glorious smoked ribs, whose aroma had our mouths watering all day long. "Made too many. I thought you could use some." No better gift could have been given to us after a hard day of renovating. We used them all right for a huge amount of eating pleasure and as a sign that we had passed muster for Benny and her friends. This began our occasional swapping of favorite dishes. We settled into the bungalow and met a kitten, Gracie, who had begged, meowed, and gobbled up the food I slipped under my work van I left parked in the driveway. She and our kitten had eyed each other through the screened-in porch for days. "Don't feed her. You know that'll make her stay, and don't make eye contact," husband had warned. Same husband, a few days later, scooped up a gray striped and furry something at the door and brought it out of the cold rain. Our first cat, Kitten Britches, spent a week pouting behind my new draperies before she resigned herself to accepting this sibling. They spent the next year of kittenhood careening around the house, sliding on the hardwood floors, knocking over vases, lamps, bowls, and each other. Benny continued to watch us, and we watched back. We definitely got the best value out of that situation. Our weekly cycle of working, coming home, and occasionally grilling on the patio was not much to see, but Benny's activities provided an endless source of entertainment for us. There were loud porch parties with lots of liquid refreshment. She and her friends knew more law than Judge Judy. When the police arrived on more than one occasion, Benny quoted it to them. "I'm still on my porch. You can't touch me on my porch." One summer evening, an argument fueled by refreshments got way out of hand. We watched out the picture window as if we were at a drive-in movie. Benny and her best friend threatened each other in the front yard. One had a garden hoe and one had a kitchen knife. The chase ensued down the street with the ladies yelling and threatening the entire way. When the police showed up, both were sitting serenely on the porch as if they had been crocheting doilies at a church circle meeting. The young cop came over and asked what we had seen and told us Benny was well known to the force, as far back as when his dad was a cop on the downtown beat, where Benny had exercised free enterprise at night. The next spring, we met Slick. We discovered that he disappeared into the 5-foot-high crawl space under Benny's house. The space could in no way be called a basement. Curious, we crept over one day when Benny and Slick were gone. The space had been converted into an apartment of sorts, complete with a vinyl floor. Benny had become a landlady to help make ends meet. We found that in addition to doing yard work around the neighborhood, Slick was self-employed in grocery sales of sorts. One late afternoon, we relaxed on the patio as Slick walked down the alley, toting a brown paper bag. "Hey, hey, brother," he shouted to husband, who met him at the fence. Slick continued as he opened the bag. "Want to buy some meat?" He held up 2 frozen pork chops, then half a package of hot dogs, then a raw chicken leg. We were sure, especially since Benny was not at home, that Slick's wholesale supplier was Benny's refrigerator. Husband declined the purchase. Months later, we missed Benny for several days. Friends came by to check her house and to pick up her mail. I asked about her and learned that she had been in the hospital with serious heart problems. After her return, the porch parties became less frequent. Friends stopped by to offer care rather than to be entertained. On August 2nd, we opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate our first anniversary before going out to dinner. Benny's friend, who had participated in the garden hoe and kitchen knife knockdown dragout, stood in her yard sobbing as an ambulance pulled up. We went out to the screened-in porch. Benny passed, she sobbed to me. She stopped taking her medicine. She couldn't afford it. Wiping tears from my eyes, I walked back into our little bungalow to share the news with husband. We raised our glasses toward the stretcher bearing our raucous, naughty, but good-hearted neighbor. Rest in peace, sister friend. Our dream of a new Hillcrest was soon quashed by the real estate crash, and family circumstances required us to sell our little bungalow and move on. Our improvements allowed us to complete a sale in a matter of days for a nice profit, but no amount of money could have made me want to miss the view from that picture window. I'm glad I didn't think twice. Tonight, for the first time, we have 2 storytellers on stage at the same time, and the duo, Lynn and Al Larson, will share a story. Lynn and Al grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and Conway, Arkansas, respectively. And the couple's paths converged in 1969 and led them to Eureka Springs 2 years later. Lynn has followed multiple career paths, most recently as instructor at Yoga for Life and as a property manager. They're great landlords.
She's a great tenant.
Al has operated a construction firm for the last 40 years. They raised 2 children, Jeffrey Larson and Sarah McGettrick Larson. I am thrilled to now welcome to the stage well-loved, longtime locals, Lynn and Al.
1969 was the year of the moon landing and Neil Armstrong's great leap for mankind. It was also the year I made the leap from impoverished student to student employee. Both of my roommates had secured jobs as nurses' aides at the psych unit at Menorah Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. Hours were 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. during the week with an occasional weekend day shift. Around that same time, Lynn had made her bid for independence as a full-time student/weekend ward clerk, same facility. I wasn't there long before I realized that if I worked weekends, I could get to be around the little ward clerk. And once she moved into the student ghetto directly across from our quarters, I asked her out and she consented to tolerate me.
Well, here's what you need to know first. I never knew that Albert requested weekends until I read it on the legal pad where he was writing his notes in preparation for this homegrown tale. I knew that he definitely caught my eye, the tall, lanky, good-looking guy whose long-sleeved white button-down shirt fit so well. Did he iron that, I wondered? There was plenty of joking around with the staff, mostly at change of shift, but I don't remember that he spoke to me at all. When I moved into that apartment, I was surprised to find those guys right across the street. Mostly we and other students in the neighborhood all just hung out until Al worked up his courage.
We had several memorable dates. We went to the Savoy Grill for lobster. That was Lynn's idea for my birthday. Other times we went to Jimmy's Jigger for wild food night and art movies like Carnal Knowledge and Through a Glass Darkly. We went to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art to see the Donald Roller Wilson show.
Do you know his work?
We attended the November moratorium in Washington, D.C., along with 500,000 others to protest the escalating war in Vietnam. Instead of walking in her college graduation, I convinced Lynn that hitchhiking to Mexico was a better idea. That fall, we traveled with Steve, my roommate, who was from Russellville, to the 1970 Eureka Springs Folk Festival. Steve worked at Menorah too. He told us, "We have to go. Every freak in Arkansas will be there." So we did, and slept in sleeping bags on the beach in Beaver.
I'm not so sure that Carnal Knowledge is an art film. We did see a lot of good movies, though. Life was good. We were young, living in a university community, making enough money to get along, and the world was changing. There was a dashiki shop down the block. Birth control pills were readily available. The war protests were happening. That trip to D.C. was a landmark. We traveled straight through from Kansas City to D.C. in an old school bus that was sponsored by the Quakers, and it was filled with fellow students. The heat didn't work, the seats were miserable, but we were on a mission. We got off the bus and saw those 500,000 other people who dressed just like we did, out of the Army-Navy surplus stores. The irony was not lost on us. That hitchhiking weekend to Mexico was one more thing that convinced me that I should spend more time with this guy. I hadn't been out of Missouri but maybe once in my life. Kansas didn't count. So someone who acted like this Mexico thing was no big deal felt like a good choice. And I was realizing how smart he was. That was a definite plus.
By fall of 1970, the School of Dentistry had assured me that I would never graduate. Perhaps it was the discrimination suit I'd filed. But my thoughts were elsewhere. Lynn and I had accumulated about $2,000 in an International Harvester Travel-All station wagon and were preparing to emigrate to Mexico. You see, the country had come to an intolerable state. Nixon, Vietnam, Agnew, enemies lists, quaint by current standards. But still, our time in Mexico was orchestrated by this volume, Mexico on $5 a day. By our calculations, our $2,000 would last us 400 days. In reality, it lasted 150. Yucatan, Guatemala, and San Cristobal de las Casas. We developed a plan to buy up what we called Mexican tourist shit, return to the U.S. where our customers were eagerly awaiting Mexican wedding shirts, and return to our beloved readouts in the Mexican highlands. The most desirable item in our inventory were the colorful hand-woven hammocks. And the best source was the Oaxaca State Penitentiary in Tehuantepec. One morning, I reported to the prison entrance and asked to see their wares. The guard opened a tiny hole in an enormously thick masonry wall and shouted, "Hamacas!" Hammocks came shooting out. Foop, foop, foop. And I would grab one up and shout, "Cuanto es?" 80 pesos. "Cuanto es?" 80 pesos. Always the same. I was sure I could get a better price if I could meet the artist face to face. The guard let me into the tidy prison courtyard with its taco stands and hammock looms, but the price was still 80 pesos. I passed out cigarettes and paid for each hammock with a 100 peso note, stuffing the change in my pocket. Back out in the street with my loot, I realized all the change was gone. Each 80 peso hammock had cost me 100 pesos. Seems like the tidy courtyard was populated by a criminal element.
One stop on our way back north was Veracruz. It was a beautiful, atmospheric port city with a European feel. My favorite memory, I'll warn you, drawn through the mists of time, is of a Spanish colonial building with a restaurant located in a long colonnade lined with massive columns that were linked with graceful arches. The thing to do there was to have café con leche. The tables were covered with white cotton cloths. The man who served the coffee was impeccably dressed in trousers and a formal shirt appropriate for the hot summer day. After pouring the coffee, he carefully picked up my coffee spoon and tapped the side of my cup several times, making a ringing sound. At that sound, a young boy, maybe 12 or so, would appear and add the steaming milk to my cup. Yeah, it was an enchanting experience. The beautiful setting, attentive professional staff, the shaded colonnade, the ringing of the cups. But there is another side of Veracruz: crime. A good bit of our loot, carefully curated for sale in the U.S., was stolen out of our car. But we persevered, stopping in Austin, staying with friends of a friend that we had met on the road, selling our imports in front of the student union, spread out on a blanket on Guadalupe with other hopeful hippie types. It was clear we were only getting by, not ensuring our future travels. We still had some of those beautiful but pricey hammocks to sell. I remembered that the Hall's department store on the Country Club Plaza in Kansas City had an ethnic shop, and the manager there had some discretionary funds. So leaving our few belongings in safekeeping, we headed to Kansas City, and sure enough, he bought them. While visiting with some friends in Kansas City, we learned that a professor of mine, Tommy Thomas, had retired to Eureka Springs. Having been there before, we decided to stop in on our way back to Austin.
Tommy had bought a dilapidated residence on Main Street, I think for $3,500. His plan was to turn it into a frame shop and art gallery. Tommy was describing the project to us and said he needed some help. When he offered me the generous sum of $2 an hour, I could hardly refuse. We got in the old Travelall, drove back to Austin, packed up our paltry belongings, and made the move to Arkansas to begin my career in subsistence carpentry.
Because we drove an old car like every other newcomer young person of the day, we soon met Larry Evans, who is with us this evening, the creative mechanic who kept all those beat-up vehicles running. If Larry didn't have the needed part, he could usually make it or refashion one. One time I pulled up to his shop with a scary, horrible noise emanating from the engine. Larry opened the hood, reached for a small tin of machine oil, and let a drop of oil fall onto the fan belt. The noise stopped. I considered him a magician. It was summer, and Al and I were camping out on the second-story porch of Georgia Peach's house down on Main Street while we looked for a place. One day, Al took me to see a little house in Elk Ranch that Larry had shown him. Larry knew about it because he and Brenda had lived there when they first married. Brenda called it their honeymoon cottage. The neighbors got us in touch with the owner, who lived in Kansas City. She was happy to rent it to us for $35 a month. Larry's daughter Kelly owns that place now. There was a shed attached to the garage, which Al saw as a potential chicken house. He fenced the yard for poultry, drove to Springdale, and bought chicks. We ate and sold a lot of eggs, 50 cents a dozen. Another friend of the newcomers was Tex Belt, who could often be found whittling on the bench in front of Clark's Market downtown. His whittling produced a smaller and smaller piece of wood. Tex was known to travel the roads in his horse-drawn buckboard. In the spring, Al asked Tex to bring his horse and plow to make a garden spot in the field in front of our house. Tex arrived with his plow and his dog Shorty in the back of the buckboard. In that garden, Al produced our first homegrown Arkansas tomato. Because of our flock of chickens and our egg sales, we became known as Lynn and Al Chicken. And so began our unexpected life in Eureka Springs 54 years ago.
Thank you. That was as wonderful as I knew it would be. And now we have another story again from Zeek.
Let's hear it again for Lynn and Al. That was fabulous. I'm going home. I'm not going to follow that. Recently, I did a talk for an arts group in Bella Vista, and then I was interviewed on different occasions shortly thereafter. And both times, well, during the Q&A session of the Art Talk, I was asked, and during the interview, the same question: was there a turning point in your career? I think this story I'm reading tonight will answer that question. Dancing was a stretch. While living in Memphis in the 70s, I proudly danced with the ballet company, Creative Arts Ballet, originally named Ballet South. It was the only integrated dance company in Memphis. Our artistic director, George Latimer, who had danced with the San Francisco Ballet, was appalled when he came to Memphis to work with the Civic Ballet Company and found out that it was not integrated. To remedy that problem, he started Ballet South and recruited black dancers to be a part of the company. Scholarships were offered to young dancers who were living in poverty, giving them an opportunity to study, dance, and to perform. At the time, I was a poor art student, and I was offered a scholarship to dance with the company. We were the contraire dance company in Memphis that did not perform the Nutcracker Suite each Christmas. We did perform classics such as Stravinsky's Firebird and Dance Giselle, but we also performed contemporary pieces. Isaac Hayes was on our board of directors. One of my favorite shows that we performed in the Overton Park Shell and elsewhere, were dances set to Memphis music, Elvis, and Isaac Hayes, of course, and Cimarron's song, The Rings. One of my fellow dancers in the company was Lowell Smith, a 6-foot-tall, beautiful black man. He was every minute a dancer, the way he walked, the way he sat, with his every movement. On Tuesday nights at the Ballet Academy, we had men's class. Before exercises, we would stretch. Lowell and I were stretching partners. He was 6 foot tall, very strong, and I was 5'6". When we would stretch each other, I thought he was going to break my bones. I can never, with my limited size and strength, make Lowell groan. I did enjoy working with Lowell, but I do have to say he was a prima donna. Eventually, Lowell went on to bigger things, the Dance Theater of Harlem. Soon after he had joined that company, I saw a segment on a TV morning show about the company, and Lowell was in the segment. The artistic director of the company said, "We don't allow divas in our company. Everyone carries their own bags while on tour, and everyone shares tasks." I saw Lowell carrying his bags in that segment. I thought, serves you right for trying to break my feet during stretching. A few years later, I watched Lowell dance during a PBS television presentation of a ballet version of A Streetcar Named Desire. Lowell beautifully danced the part of Stanley. He was elegant. It made me proud to have danced in the same company with him during an interesting time in Memphis when Ballet South was the only company that gave equal opportunities to dancers of color. Seeing Lowell dance on television that night, in a strange way, changed my life. I was in art school at the same time I was dancing with Ballet South. The dance company was semi-professional, and that meant I was only paid every now and then. When finished with art school, I wondered how I was going to make a living. Creating income as a visual artist was difficult, and I could not get by with an occasional check from the ballet company. My mother, who had been a beautician for most of her life, suggested I go to beauty school. She said, "I made a good living doing that, and you know what that profession involves," and that's what I did. I went to cosmetology school in Memphis, and I received additional training in Philadelphia and New York City. Except for dabbling with paint every now and then, I put art on the back burner. That is, until the night I saw Lowell dancing on television. After watching the performance, I was sitting there thinking, what if I had continued to dance? I had regrets for not doing so. I asked myself if I had other regrets. I thought no, but I didn't want to wake up some years later with other regrets. And I knew what one would be, and that would be regretting not pursuing my career as an artist. I was 40 years old at the time. I began painting constantly, I was a little rusty at first, but soon got back into the saddle, so to speak. When I felt my work was good enough, I began hanging it in the salon where I worked. One of my customers worked for a national print company, the Franklin Company of Chicago. She said, "I think my company would be interested in your work." She sent samples, and yes, they wanted to carry my work as signed limited edition framed prints. All of a sudden, my work was in showrooms from coast to coast, including New York City, Atlanta, Dallas, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Buyers from galleries, high-end boutiques, and department stores published the prints. Dillard's and Neiman Marcus carried them in all their stores. And I did personal appearances at markets and stores promoting the prints. That was the beginning of my career as a truly professional artist. Although he never knew it, that beautiful dancer, Lowell Smith, kick-started my career. Unfortunately, Lowell died in New York City at the age of 57 in 2007. He was so well known in the dance world that his obituary was in the New York Times. I'm so honored to have known Lowell, and I'm happy that he received acclaim and had a wonderful career. I also thank him for inspiring me to get off my butt, make art, and to live a life without regrets. Lowell, thank you, and wherever you are, I hope you're still dancing. Thank you, and here again is my friend and co-producer, Sandra Spotts.
This story is called Let's Put on a Show. In the 1950s, children were, for the most part, free range, if not feral. Few activities, aside from Little League baseball or dance lessons, were organized, and those were not daily. The general rule was to disappear outdoors within specified perimeters and entertain yourself until supper time. The same rule applied to summer break. Go do something and don't bother the grown-ups. One particular summer, perhaps driven by watching too many reruns of Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland movies from our parents' era, we neighborhood kids decided to put on a show. The venue would be the front porch of the playhouse my dad had quickly built from scrap lumber. We had visited my cousins the Easter before and coveted their newly built playhouse, complete with working electricity, flower boxes, and functioning windows. Daddy, tired of our whining, despite his limited carpentry skills, threw together our part pink, part blue, part white scrappy house with square cutouts for windows and doors. Crude as it was, it worked for sparking our imaginations, and now the front porch would become a grand stage. Our friend Robin down the street took dance lessons and owned a closet full of costumes we could use for the show. Sister and I were the only other girls in the neighborhood, so we had our pick. I chose a Kelly green dress with shamrocks on the skirt. Since I was the youngest in the gang, it probably was the only costume that would fit me. That wardrobe choice determined what my act would be. Sister chose a yellow frock with a flowing skirt, and Robin picked a white chiffon formal. Despite her tiny saltbox house, this array of glamorous costumes and the ability to take dance lessons had me thinking that Robin was the richest girl I knew, and in many ways she probably was. We trekked back up the hill to our house, secured crayons, scissors, and a couple of scratch pads Daddy brought home from the printing company where he worked. We made a stack of tickets and then set out to sell them. We soon discovered a major hitch in our production. All of the kids in our neighborhood were in the show, so they wouldn't be purchasing tickets, and parents were too busy with grown-up stuff to be distracted by our nonsense. We were faced with a major tenet of marketing. In order to market goods or services, you must have a market. Despite our dismal ticket sales, we knew the show must always go on, and it did. Finally, it was showtime. I positioned myself on the small patch of clover under the clothesline adjacent to the playhouse stage. I prissily spread my shamrock skirt and sang Four-Leaf Clover. Most likely, I knew the lyrics from hearing it on the TV show Your Hit Parade. I'm sure it was delivered in the only way I have ever known how to sing, with great sincerity and grossly off-key. Sisters stood on the stage and sang Turkey in the Straw, joined impromptu by all of us backup singers. Robin performed a ballet in her floaty chiffon. The boys, brothers Bo and Joe, who were not twins, exhibited their skills of daring and balance on our homemade stilts, launching from the picnic table. Soon after the show, the sun began to lower and the seductive aromas of suppers being prepared wafted in. We called it a wrap, although we had no idea of that term, and headed our separate ways, knowing, giving very little but our imaginations, we could go anywhere and even become stars. That is our show, and we are so glad that you came. We want to remind you that our next show will be June 4th, and our guest reader will be Judy Montgomery, and our guest musician will be Shane Causey.
Thank you so much for coming.
You've been listening to Homegrown Tales, a live storytelling event held at Brews, 2 Pine Spring in Eureka Springs. Join us again next time for more Homegrown Tales.